Hi, I'm Patrick Higgins. We approach 2023 with a slowing global economy, war in Europe, an accelerating climate emergency, and changing attitudes and expectations of customers, employees, and other stakeholders. Rarely have businesses faced a more uncertain future. So over the next 4 episodes, we'll be covering everything from geopolitics and globalization to organizational transformation, leadership, culture, purpose, and what businesses and their leaders have to do to create sustainable value. I hope you enjoy the ride.